Alrighty, I hope everyone had a good break. We're going to be jumping into the third and final session of the workshop today, and we will be looking at these glass bottles over here. Now, this is a pretty intense path trace scene, so I'm just going to bring up the warning again. This is going to hit my GPU pretty hard. It'll probably hit yours hard as well. So in the rare occasion this may crash, this is 100% not Notch's fault. This is my fault because I turned all the settings way past 11. So we're going to be doing a lot of post-processing. We're going to have some heavy depth of field. And our ray tracing is going to have to go through multiple bottles at once to generate the lighting. So let's jump into what we'll be doing. All right. If we open this scene up here, first things first, this is an image 2D, just holding pattern. This is just so I can explain what's going on. So what we have is our lighting setup. So we've got a skylight, environment map, and a light. We have our tabletop. We have our cloner system up here, which I'll explain a little bit later. And then we have our procedurals. So let's get into this. I'm going to disable the image 2D. And before I actually let this ray trace, I'm just going to press our home key and our start button. And that is just going to allow us just to let it run for a little bit first. Okay, cool. Now let's turn our ray tracing on and see how we go. Thinking. Okay, here we go. Cool, that's a success. So what we're seeing here now is just 8 bottles at the moment, but we're getting that really nice spill through here. I've also limited our refine steps down here to 10, just because I want to be able to show this semi in action. So I'm just going to let this play out. It's going to be very stuttery for you, but you can see as bottles come up and down, we get this really, really nice light spill coming through. And yeah, the reason that's actually there is we've got a normal light as well, just helping us out and push that light through. All right, now let's run the gauntlet. I'm going to turn this off. I'm going to set it back to home. I'm going to come into our cloner here, and I'm going to give us 32 clones. All right, before we hit go on this, I just want to explain the cloner system and how it's set up the way it is. We have a clone to mesh, and that is referencing a shape 3D circle. Now, the reason for this is we just want to spread them out around a circle. One problem we will run into, though, using a clone to mesh is that our shapes may overlap. And that might not be a normal problem when we're doing things like opaque spheres, but with glass, it's a really big problem if things are overlapping each other. So I really want to make sure that we don't have any overlaps. And because of that, I'm using a rigid body effector. Now, I've come in here and modified it. We'll go through all those settings as we do the build. But basically, I've turned off gravity, I've turned off floor collision, and I've plumped in a shape 3D that is roughly a cylinder the rough size of our bottles. So now when we run this mesh solver, home and run, that first couple of frames, you'll just see everything just pushing each other out the way. And that's the rigid body system at work. So now when I let this run, we're just going to give it all the time it needs. So now none of these bottles are overlapping. We're getting a lot of really nice refraction and reflections coming through all those bottles and getting some nice color spill onto the table below it. I'm just going to let this finish rendering out before I do anything else, as I really don't want to overload this system. As you can see, my mouse is starting to stutter just moving it around. Okay, there we're at. I'm going to disable that for now. All right, let's move across just to one single bottle. We can get a better idea of how this system works using the one bottle. So here again, we've got that really nice orange highlight that's shown whenever the directional light comes through. So what I'm going to do down here, while we've got just a single light spinning around, a single bottle, is I'm going to disable this one directional light. So this is just our area light. So our skylight, because we're using this video image, let me pause it here. If we turn off this, now our skylight's just coming down from the top and is just a single white color. We might get a little bit of reflection of some surfaces and maybe some refraction looking through it, but we're not getting any detail. So if I turn that off and just use our point light sort of source, now we're getting a very distinct color shadow here and a little bit of highlights through as we're looking through the bottle, but we're losing all of that environment detail. So when we combine a skylight with the HDR background, now because this skylight has it's kind of directional where most of the light is coming from, Notch is determining that this is the way that the light should fall. And when we're adding our punch light, I guess, to accentuate this shadow, if we make it a child of a null, we can actually rotate the null around and orbit this camera so we can match up where this light should be with the shadow that falls from our environment. So I'm just going to reset that because I know it works at 115. Okay, now let's actually jump into how this is built. So this is just a gray box. We are looking now at our procedural system. So obviously starting off, we have our procedural root. Nothing has changed on here. It's just a 111. We have our bounding box that is running to both of the procedural meshing nodes. We have a separate meshing node for our liquid than for our glass, as we need to run a separate material. So let's first start by cutting into our shape. Because both of these procedural meshing nodes have sealed boundaries turned on, we can actually just grab our bounding box and move it, let's just say -1. And now I can get a nice look at what's happening inside in here. So we have the main bottle body, which is the wide section. I'm going to pause this when it gets to the top. Here we go. So just disabling the liquid and disabling our subtracts. Let's go all the way from the start. So we have our initial bottle body, which is a cylinder. We then have a neck section, which is smooth union joined in. And then for a bit more detail, we have a primitive torus that is the neck of our bottle at the top. So as a cut through look, it looks like this. Then we are subtracting a volume from the middle, which is the cavity inside. And we're putting a child object of that as the sub neck. And because that is a child of this, while this cylinder is a child of here, and it is union inside of this section here, smooth union actually, because the top of that stack is set to subtract, this and this will subtract from this stack. So there are two separate stacks, if you can imagine. All right, so now we have our bottle hollowed out. So how do we get the liquid inside to look kind of right? Well, the lucky thing is the shape of the liquid is going to be virtually the same as the shape of our hollow space, because that's what it's going to fill. So we can copy across the inside shape here that our subtractions are and just bring them as a filled version inside here. As long as we change this to, we don't need to change it, but let's just change it to a union and plug it into a procedural mesh, it'll function the same way. We will need to make it just slightly smaller though, because if they are occupying exactly the same zone, they will technically cross over each other and then the refraction just won't look as nice. So we just need to make it a little bit smaller. But yeah, so we can now see our mesh is filling up nicely. So what is actually controlling this up and down movement? Now there are two separate primitive boxes. If I pause this, you can see that there is a box shape, primitive box, set to subtract. And that is oscillating up and down via a math square noise that is running through a smoothing envelope. And the range remap is in here is just telling us how high do we want to go when it's maximum, how low do we want to go when it's minimum. And on our liquid side, we just have the box set to be a little bit lower when it's moving up and down. So it just subtracts more of the liquid away, giving the look like the liquid is always just below the rim of the glass or the neck of the bottle. Another thing that's been added here is there's a little bit of displacement on the liquid surface to make it look like it's moving around. And the way that was achieved was by, let me just turn this to a union for now, by putting a FBM displacement on the box that is being subtracted. And by doing that, we are now subtracting that wavy surface away from the top of the liquid. Okay. All right, this is enough of me yapping at you guys. So it is time to jump into the build. All right, so we're going to go into our bottle service start scene. And this is completely empty. So we're going to be going fairly quickly through this, but we should be pretty good. All right, first things first. In our root settings, we want to make sure that deferred rendering is ticked. We want to make sure that high dynamic range is ticked and linear space lighting is ticked. We don't need ray tracing on at the moment, so we can leave that as off. And we're going to add the first node as a skylight. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to need a procedural root. So procedural root. We're going to need a procedural meshing node. We're going to need two of these, but first of all, we're just going to start with the glass. So let's link that in. And then we're going to need a bounding box. I'm just going to link that into our bounding box of our procedural meshing. Just so we know how we're going, I'm just going to press F5 and name this one proc mesh underscore glass. 3 S's, that's fine. Just so we're going here. So let's get going. Our proc mesh, we want to start at 256, 256, 256. We're going to give it an error tolerance of 1. And we are going to give it a smoothing of 20. Now, if you're finding when you're building this, it's starting to lag, you can always take this smoothing iteration out and then add it back in later. All right, let's add some primitives to it. So primitive generator, let's drag this in. So again, before we're going to start with the body of this bottle. And when we link that in here, we're going to see it's a, oh, sorry, put it into the 5 view. When we link this in here, we're going to see it comes in as a sphere. We actually want that to be a cylinder. So a cylinder. And I've got the numbers written down here for our size. So we want to actually go 0.25 for our width. We want to go 0.7 for our height. And we can just decide to have a round bottle, but I think it looks much nicer if it's got a few facets around the outside. So inside our primitive, we want to change it from circular to polygonal. And 8 is a good number. I'm going to leave it as 8. So now all we want to do here is just want to drop it down in position. So negative 0.25. And that's just going to drop it down to the bottom of our bounding box. Cool. All right. What do we want to do next? We want to make sure this one is set to union, and then we can work on our next lot. So let's press F5 and go bottle body. Drag in a new primitive. Make it the child object of the one above. This one is also going to be a cylinder. And this is going to be our bottle neck. So we are going to make the radius 0.09. We're going to make the height 0.5. We're going to position it at 1 in vertical space because we need it to sit at the top of our bottle. And we're not worried if it overlaps top and bottom too much. And we're going to change this one here into a smooth union. All right. And our blend weight in this smooth union, we're going to change from 1 down to about 0.7. Just so it gets us those nice shoulder looks there without being too smooth or too rough. Okay. Now we're looking at the top here. It's probably a good chance to come in here and say, all right, in our procedural meshing, we want to add our seal boundaries. All right. Now for the bottle lip. Again, another 3D primitive. Bring it in as a child object. Please ignore that notification. A 3D primitive, and we're going to set this to a torus. This torus is massive, so we are just going to change the side of the inside radius to 0.04 and the outer radius to 0.075. Okay, it's going to drop this up until it's roughly at the top. So about 0.17 is where we're looking at. Okay, that's looking good. We just want to leave this one as union. It doesn't need to be smooth union because we want a nice sort of sharp bubble at the top there. And I guess while we're at it, let's set both the neck and the torus to be polygonal as well, so we get those nice faceted sides. Cool. All right. Now we have our outside of the bottle looking well. So let's do the same trick as before. Let's take our bounding box and move it to -1 in space so we can see inside. And let's start making our subtracting shapes. So we can start by just copying what we have here for the neck and for the body. So we select those two, Control D to make a new one. Let's link these into the procedural meshing. Okay. We've gotten this far. It's probably a good time to save our project as well. So just Control S. Now what we'll be doing here is we'll be taking basically the same shapes, but shrinking them down so that they fit nicely inside. So this will now be our F5 subtract body. And the subtract body, we're going to change our cylinder radius to 0.2. We're also going to make it subtract first. Okay. We are going to change our height to 0.56. And we're going to change our Y position to -0.25, which it is there. And that is set to subtract. So now we can see we're pulling in that nice internal volume. Okay. So the neck is still too large. So let's move to that now. This is going to be a radius of 0.07. The height is going to be 0.5 again, and the position is still going to be 1. Now this is going to be a smooth union, but we are also just going to make sure that we check inside. Oh, sorry. Just going to make sure that we check inside that it's not cutting away too much of the internal volume. Cool, that looks pretty good. All right, now we have the outside of the bottle done. We can create a new procedural meshing glass, and we're going to change this one into F5 Proc Mesh Liquid. And we're going to give it our bounding box. And what we can do, like I said before, with our liquid, we can start inside with these ones from our subtractions. So if we just duplicate that across, bring that in. This needs to be linked in, unfortunately. I forgot that step. So yeah, make sure your procedural mesh is linked in. Now's a good time to set our materials just so we can get something viewable. So just go material. Link that in, and let's just make this one blue just so we can see what we're doing. So at the moment, we can see that the neck is probably a little bit too close for call. So let's just fix that up a bit. So our subtract body, we can now call liquid body. And the size here is going to change just a tiny bit. So it's going to go from 0.2 to 0.199. The height is going to change from 0.56 to... Oh, that's why it's wrong. Okay, disregard. So this one was actually supposed to be 0.65, not 0.56. That makes more sense. Okay, cool. So the main body was 0.65 high on the subtraction. And now the body in here is going to be 0.659. 0.649. So just a tiny little bit smaller. Okay. Now moving into the neck part here, We're going to look in there and say, look, our neck radius is going to be 0.06. And the cylinder height is still fine to be 0.5. The CSG blend weight, though, we're just going to bump it up a little bit to 0.75, just to fill that arch in just a little bit more. I think that's looking pretty good. Okay, so now we can take our bounding box back to 0. And we have a bottle filled with blue liquid. All right, we're done. Nah, just kidding. Plenty more to go. So what we need to do add in now is our subtractors. So let's start cleaning this graph up a little bit first so we can easily see what we're doing. Let's add a region and drag that in. Now these regions have little boxes in the corners. You can click and drag down. So let's just set one region around this area roughly and call it glass. Clean that up a little bit. And then you can just Control D, duplicate another one, and call this one liquid. It's just much easier to look at later on once you've built to find out how you've set this up. Okay, so we can make these all nest in nicely under each other. So again, the flow is procedural route into the mesh. It's going to hit the top level of this, which is our body, and the top level of this one, like so. And there. All right, so we need to subtract this away. So we need another primitive. I apologize if you can hear the cat in the background. It is trying its hardest to get into this office right now. Now this needs to be connected to our procedural meshing. This is going to fill this whole space right now. We definitely don't want that. We want this to be a box. Now this box, we also want to set to subtract. Now, because this is sitting below everything else, again, the order of operations is really important. This box is sitting below everything, so it is subtracting everything above it. Okay, so now when we take this box, we can say we want to move it up and move it down to get our positions. All right, so same thing across. We're just going to duplicate the same box, and we're going to bring it across to our procedural mesh under our liquid. Cool. All right, one thing we want to add to the box again over here. So if we lift this up just a little bit, we want to be able to add that nice liquid sort of wavy effect here. So we want to look for an FBM displacement, attach that to the 3D primitive. And you can start to see it here. What we're going to add now is a continuous modifier just into our FBM, run into the position Y, and set the speed to 0.1. And now, if I zoom in here, you can see we're just getting a little bit of water-like surface displacement, which is really, really nice to have. So setting that to 0. Okay, now we want to animate these height, like subtractors, let's call them that. And to do that, we're going to need math modifiers. These math modifiers are going to be set to square. And I believe the scale was 0.25. Nope. Scale was 1. Now we come in here. We are going to be setting our speed to 0.125. So they're rather large. We're going to be running this into a smoothing envelope modifier because we don't want them to jump up and down straight away. And we're also going to use a range remap. So just for starters now, we're going to run this into here, set this to our Y position, and you can see it's jumping up and down slightly. We need it to go more than just 1 and 0. So a range remap node is going to be needed. Let's plug this in line. So our range remap is going to go from 0 to 1 in, but it's going to go to from 0.5 to 2. Oh, 2, not 21, at its height. So now when it comes in, it's going to fill all the way up and it's going to come all the way back down. Now our smoothing is probably a little bit slow here, so we're going to change that to 2.5 and 2.5. So it's going to ramp up quickly between our movements and go all the way up to the top. So what we can do is we can come across here, duplicate this same up and down movement if you want, or we can actually reference exactly the same one. So just take our smooth envelope out, put it into here, and now we have both of our liquid and our glass moving at the same speed. What we want to do at this point now is just move this down -0.1 in Z space. Now, again, that is the subtractor primitive for the liquid. And we're doing that just so when the bottle and water rise together, the liquid is always just below the neck of the bottle or the neck of the glass. It just makes it look a lot nicer. Okay, cool. All right, now we've got that sort of set up. We can work on our cloning system. So let's maybe add one more region. So click that one there, Control D, drag our region in here. And just label this up as height subtractors. Okay. So our bottle system is completely built. We now have our bounding box, procedural meshing route, and all of our systems built inside there. So the look we had originally had a table in it. So let's start by building that table. Now the table we're going to be using is just a shape 3D. And bring it across this side. We're going to hook that up to the root node. We don't want to be using a sphere, sorry. We want to be using a rounded cylinder. The radius is going to be 4.5. So a rather large table. Our size in Y is only actually going to be 0.2. So it doesn't need to be huge. Now, because this is going to be used in a fairly high-end rendered scene, we actually want to jump up these edges counts because we don't want it to be 20. We want it to be 128. And we can probably drop the subdivisions down to something like 16. Okay, this is pretty cool. All we need to do now is move this -1.05 in Y space, and now our bottles are sitting nicely on the table. Well, our single bottle. To help with this, we're going to add a material as well to our mesh. Now, as we're going to be adding a lot of lighting to this, we just want to make sure that we're not using a white material. Let's just drag it down so it's roughly about 128 in all of our channels. That's just going to help us with our lighting much later. 127 is fine. And while we're here, we're going to give it a metallicness of 0.4 and a roughness of 0.15. Okay, now it's time to add our cloning system in here. So what we need to add first is a clone to mesh. So type in clone to in your finder and you'll find a clone to mesh node. This clone to mesh node is actually going to require something because it's going to input in yellow here, and that is an object node, so a source object. So let's hook this up to our root. And our source object is going to be a shape 3D circle. Let's move that out of the way. Now we're going to come in here. We're going to change our source object into a circle of radius 4 and a subdivisions in X of 64, just so there's a lot more to work with. We're going to plug that in. Okay, now we can see our clone to mesh is working fine. The next thing we're going to do inside of our clone to mesh is we're going to change our mode from vertex mode to spread over surface. This is just going to make sure that all of our clones are spread evenly across the surface of that circle. The other thing we need to do in here is just change our clone count from 100 to 8, because we do not want to immediately crash our systems as soon as this comes out. All right, so we've got our clone to mesh and our box ready to go. Sorry, our circle ready to go into there. The next thing we want to do is add our rigid body effector. So RIGID, rigid body effector. So we're going to feed this output into the input here of the clone to mesh effectors. Now, again, we're using a rigid body effector to push the bottles away from each other if they're overlapping, because on all the tests I've done with clone to mesh, they always overlap these bottles. So inside our rigid body effector, we want to come in and say our shape type is going to be an input 3D object. Now we want it to be that because we can define a shape then for the bounds of that rigid body. We want to say the type is going to be 10 faces cylinder in y-axis. We're also going to come in and say our max velocity is 0. Our maximum angular velocity is 0. Our gravity is 0. Our dampening is 100. And our time to idle is 0. And the reason for these effects is we don't want it to be affected by gravity. We don't want it to be affected by things. Oh, also make sure the floor collision is also disabled. We just want this to create a short impulse just to push the bottles away from each other based on that mesh. So let's create that shape. So it is a shape 3D. Bring it in. Now this shape 3D is going to be a cylinder. We want to set the radius to 0.45. And we want to set the subdivisions only to 8 in round and 1 in height. We can probably get away with using 6, but 8's probably not too bad at that point. We're going to take the output of this shape 3D and feed it into the collision shapes input of our rigid body effector. Okay, so now it's going to generate meshes. It's going to push them apart. But what if it pushes them too further? Now that's where our kill box effector comes in. We're going to drop that in. Also, we're going to run the output of this into the effectors of our clone to mesh. Now this kill box effector is basically going to say, all right, what is either inside or outside this volume? Get rid of it. So we're going to invert our fall off. So everything outside the volume is what we don't want. We're going to change our fall off to 2 and our inner fall off to 1.9. We also want to make sure that our fall off mode is sphere, just so the round is what we're looking for here. All right, that is our cloner system built. Now is a fantastic time to save, so Control S. Once that's finished saving, we're going to unhook our procedural root from the scene root node. We're going to press our home key, and we're going to ensure that our playhead is not running. And we're going to take an output from our clone to mesh and put it as the input for our procedural root. Now, if we hit home again, press spacebar, we now have 8 bottles that spawn. And they're all doing the same motion. They're all the same material currently. But now we have our look going. So this is the basic. We've kind of built the system now that works. Now we can jump into the really chunky sort of stuff, which is the lighting and the materials. So right now, we can leave the materials as they are because we're going to be hitting a few extra processing speed bumps along the way. So let's set up our skylight and our ray tracing. So at the moment, we want to come across here and say, all right, we've got our skylight. We want to turn our ray tracing on. We're going to come in here and make sure that our translucent shadows. Oh, sorry. We actually have to add path tracing first. So let me just jump in here and go Pathtracer. Bring that in. Connect that to the root node. We want to come in here and also add an RT refine node. Bring that in. Also connect that to the root node. Before we go too much further, we just want to set our refines down to something like 5. Just for now, because things can get a little bit out of hand really quickly. In our Pathtracer, these settings are generally pretty good, but I'm going to bump up our refraction amount to 15 and our glossy reflection to 5, just so we can, when we get our bottles and our glass working a bit later, we can see through it a bit nicer. Now, immediately you can see that we've got a bit of reflection going on here. That's really nice. So our skylight is on. Our ray tracing is set to on. Our translucent shadows, we're also going to tick on at this point. And that is going to be it for the skylight. Now we want to feed in that same image we had before. So let's drag in the Shanghai HDRI image from hdrihaven.com. And to make this work with our skylight, we are going to need an environment image. Drag that in, connect in our image here. And now our scene is being lit by that environment image. Alrighty. So now's probably a good time to start adding our material in. Let's just take our ray tracing off, come across to RT glass material. So let's start with our glass section. So the standard glass will work fine just in here. We're going to remove the material we've got for our liquid. Delete that out. Bring in an RT glass and also hook that into, oops, sorry, that was the wrong node. We'll hook up a glass RT material, hook that in, and let's turn on our ray tracing. All right, so inside the liquid, we want to come in and change. Now, remember, we're not doing our specular color or our diffuse color. We're changing our absorption color. Let's just set this to a blue. And then when we turn our absorption up, I'm just going to go to 5. We can see that we're getting not only the color of the liquid working, but we're getting some of this nice spill coming in. It's going to be very hard here onto the ground. Now, this is the point where I'm going to say this is going to start hitting your GPU pretty hard because we're going to start playing around with a lot more lighting. So what we can see is the HDRI image has a dominant light direction, and that's where this spill is coming from. But we want to add a bit more punch to that particular blue streak on the bottom of the table there. So I'm going to change our refines probably up to about 10, just so we can get a bit of a clearer resolve. And we're going to add another light. So light. We're going to put a null in between this light and the root node. So a null. Connect that to the root. And then connect this light to that null. I'm just going to turn off the ray tracing here just for a second so it's easier for me to work around. Okay. So the purpose of this light is we come in, we make sure that it casts shadows. Our shadows are ray traced. And our translucency is set to on. But what we want to do, by making it a null, we can actually just change the rotation of this. If we move it backwards, we can match some things. So let's just come in here and adjust how this needs to work. So our light needs to have a Y position of 1, a Z position of -4 to move it back away. And we're going to give it a pitch of 30. So you can start to see some of these shadows creeping in here. Now, the reason we use this null is we can use this heading now to orbit this light around and match those dominant shadows. All right. So we're going to come in also and change some more things in this light. Our cone angle is going to be set to 90. Our brightness is going to be set to 2. We give it more punch. We've already set it to cast shadows. We've already set it to ray traced. We're going to change the softness of our ray tracing to be 0.25. And we're going to just bump up the ray tracing samples to be 2 as well. Now when we enable ray tracing again, we're getting far more distinct blue lines. So again, we were saying before, we want to try and line up these 2 different lighting systems to make them work. Now, I've already had a look around and found that 115 is the perfect alignment for this particular HDRI. So we're going to leave that there. So now we have our lighting set up, which is pretty cool. So next we are going to add our camera. So we can bring in a camera. Drop it in. We're going to also make this the child of a null. Connect that to the root node. Connect that to the camera. It's going to clean up our lighting a bit. Again, just turning off our ray tracing. Oh no, I might have clicked on the VR one by accident. Yep, I did. So I'm just going to take a second to turn that off because that is going to chew some more power we don't have. So let's just take a moment to clean up some of our graph here. Just so we're just making sure we know where everything is. So our camera. So our camera is going to be sitting here. We got this selected. If we press the 0 key on our keypad, our row of keys, and then drag our position of our camera back, we're going to set this to a -6. And then in our null, we are going to adjust our pitch to be 25, I believe. Cool. There we go. All right, so what we can do here is we can say we want to add a contiguous modifier to the null in the heading. And let's just say this is going to be going at 22.5. So now our camera is going to orbit our scene once every 8 seconds. 16 seconds? 70 seconds. We're going to add a math modifier here. We are going to change the speed to 0.125. We're going to change the scale to 30. And now we are going to plug this into the null, controlling its pitch. So now we have a nice sine wave going up and down, looking at our bottles. Let's maybe change the time mode here to be use deltas so it doesn't interrupt when it switches around. Okay, now let's turn on our ray tracing. So we've got our blues. We've got our camera moving around. It's not super exciting. It doesn't look exactly like our other image because we only have one color. So again, let's disable ray tracing, press our home key, and it's time to duplicate this entire procedural system 4 times. So 1 here, 2, and Control Z, and another one. We're going to hook the output of our clone to mesh to all of them. Now, here's a really, really cool trick I picked up from Elon Hammer. If you drag out from a node and press and hold the shift key, you can release on top of multiple objects. And click on, on top of multiple objects, so you basically link multiple things together. So that last one there. Now, pressing home, spacebar. If we enable ray tracing now, I can come into the material we've set for the glass and say I want this one to be red. And then we can come across and say I want the third one to be yellow. And the fourth one, let's just give him green. So now we can see the light streaks are starting to be a lot more prominent. They're coming in from the source of the point light here, our spotlight. And okay, I'm just gonna save the scene here. I'm gonna see what it looks like with a lot more lights in, a lot more bottles. So let's go 32. Press home, press spacebar. It's thinking about it. Okay, that's definitely getting closer to the look we were looking for before. So we're getting all of these bottles and their liquids all refracting and reflecting into each other. They're getting some nice spill. It's definitely chewing a lot more resources. But this is the basic look we've got now. I've got a couple more minutes, so we're just going to jump into some post-processing, and then we'll pose this for a hero shot and go from there. So we want to add some posts. First thing we really want to add is some FXAA anti-aliasing, which is going to help smooth out some of the lines. So lock that in. We're going to add a glow. This glow is going to be way too intense at the start. So we're going to change our intensity of the glow to 0.45 and our threshold to 0.89. Just so only the real highlights are showing. We're going to add a film grading. Normally this is used as overkill color fringing, but we don't really want that. So our blur amount is going to be 0.15. Our blur scale is going to be 0.35. And our chromatic is going to be 0.05. It's just a little bit of color fringing right on the edges is all we want. And the last one for our post is going to be our depth of field. So depth of field. We're going to add this in, Control R. We're going to come in and we're just going to change a few settings in here. Our sampling quality is going to be 4. We're going to take off apply to opaque objects here. And now we're going to jump into our camera settings. Now, if we want to roll the dice, let's enable ray tracing. Actually, I might drop the number of clones down to 8 just so we can do this and you can see a bit better what this will look like. So let's just change this to 8. Home, space, enable ray tracing. So we're going to turn it to our camera. We're going to come along here and say our focal plane distance is going to be 4. And our focal range is going to be 3. And that's just going to blur out everything in the background and give us a really, really nice sort of look. Again, this is going to look a little washed out with some of the glows, but remember though, we're adding a lot more bottles, which will take out a lot of this glowing glass. Alrighty, so if we want right now, we can probably add in some normal maps. So what we did in the first one, the version over here, if we come back to what we started with, is I added in a normal map on the ground. Let that load in. Coming in. It's going to take you a second to render again. These are very heavy scenes. They're not real time. So please just bear with me. Let's go turn that off actually. So yeah, we've come in here and we've just basically added a plasma into a video null, run that through a generate normals, and then fed that into our normal input for our material, which has given us that ribbed sort of look there. That's the main difference. Just want to check on our path tracing. So it's 3, 5, and 15 is what we used. Okay, that's fair enough. So yeah, we've now created the bottle service look. I mean, F1. We can probably come in here and give these a little bit more absorption. So let's just say all of our glass, holding control to select them all, and say our absorption is going to be 10. Just to really punch those colors in a little bit more. All right, for a little bit more difference in the heights, I'm just going to, again, disable ray tracing. I'm aware of the time we're ticking down. If we come into our math modifier here, there is actually a time offset allowance. So if I come into the math modifier and change our time offset to 0.25 for the second one, 0.5 for the third, and 0.75 for the last. Now when I run this, you will see different bottles are oscillating at different times. So for our final render, which we're going to show, we're going to come to clone to mesh. We're going to change it to 32 bottles. We're going to save. Now we're going to press spacebar. let a few of these propagate out. Wait until we've got a zone where we can see the shadows will look nice. And then we're going to hit play. Thank you, timer. So this is our scene. We have ray traced glass with liquid filled. We're using both the skylight and a directional light to pop our colors out of here. We've got some post effects on it. And we haven't crashed our computer. So I call that a win. Well, there's going to be one final thing I want to go through just before we end this workshop. And that is using procedurals as a modeling tool for external software. So this will be really quick. So down the bottom, underneath all of these other nodes, layers, sorry, there is one called exporting. Now, if I jump into this, what we can actually use is a really cool node called the geometry exporter. So if we come in geometry exporter, if we link that into our procedural meshing, so output from procedural meshing into the input of geometry exporter, hook our geometry exporter into our root node, and then we can come in and say, bake properties. I want to bake out my procedural generated mesh as either an animated OBJ sequence or an alembic. I can say the frame rate, say where it's going to be. If I want to adjust the specific part of time to select it, I'll just press F2 and F2, and that will take me to the timeline view of this particular node, and I can just crop in which part I want to export. All right, F1, F1 to bring us back in, and when we're ready to go, we can click Bake Now, and that will export that geometry. So this one is just basically a main sphere with a second sphere taken away, a box removing the bottom of the system so it's flat, and a torus just around the base. So it looks there. The other cool thing I want to really touch on just quickly, and this one's going to be credit to Ryan Barth. I saw this in his Notch con talk. You can actually export out a whole heap of different passes. So let's just go F11 and bring up this whole system here. You can use a node called gbuffer to image to come in and select different render passes. So things like normals or like false colors or world positions. And you can export all of these out as videos alongside your other video as well. And that's all going to come out of this video exporter. So let's just get out of this, F11. So the video exporter, we're going to drag in, is going to become a child of our gbuffer to image. So gbuffer to image into here. Now, if you hold down Shift and double click on a video node, you can actually choose what is going to be fed into it. So at the moment, we want to say this one will be like something like normal world space. So because I've got these already in here, what I want to say is if I want to say export my normals that are set for the camera view, I can click on my video exporter, press F2 and F2, find where it is. I can select again the range that I want to use it from. I can adjust my file name, my width, my height, and go into my export properties as well. And when I'm ready to export it, all I need to do is go into View, Render Queue, and then drag from my layer here, I want to grab the name and just drag it into the render queue. And you can do this with multiple of these at once. Oh, sorry, one more in here. So now when I hit render on my render queue, I'm going to render out all of these different render passes. So if you're using something like Nuke to do a final composite and you want to change things around or change some colors for very specific materials, you can export a material pass and then come in and say, like, I want to, an object ID pass, and say, like, everything with this material, I want to be able to select using a chroma selection and then hue shift that. It's just a really fantastic option I didn't really know existed until just recently. And I think that's really useful. So I'm just going to take this time at the moment to say thank you to the TDSW team, Yuki and Yasushi, for having me today. I hope everyone has learned something cool. It's been a really fun opportunity to present this to everyone. And I also just want to have a quick point out that in the documentation that was sent out, there is a course overview. And inside that course overview, one of the final pages is a set of links. Links to my socials, to TDSW socials, the Notch links as well, including the manual pages, and also some fantastic resources on YouTube for some great community creators. So I highly recommend you go and check out things by Armin, by Kev, Sean Bowes, and Adrian Ravelli as well. They make some fantastic content and tutorials. Definitely go check them out as well. So thank you again. Hope everyone has had a productive session and you've learned something, and I hope to see you back on another one of these sometime soon. Have a fantastic day.